The US Health Department says loneliness can be as bad for your health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. But as we try to combat what an increasing number of researchers are calling a global loneliness epidemic, are services like AI chatbots and paid companions the solution? And as more people turn to them, fueling a growing loneliness economy, how is it affecting our relationships and our ability to make meaningful connections? I'm Izzy Wells, and this is Connected on TaiwanPlus. To help us understand the loneliness economy and the tech and products behind it, we're joined by Eli Morimoto, a writer on tech and human connection and the author of the Loneliness Economy substack. Welcome to the show, Eli.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
So let's start with, when we refer to the loneliness economy, what does this term actually mean?
The loneliness economy can be defined as businesses and services claiming to alleviate or centered around loneliness or one-personhood. So it can really span everything from dating apps or social friend apps, rent-a-friend services, AI friends, single appliances for solo livers, to solo travel, companionship, pets for the elderly, the pet economy. So you can see how it really spans a wide variety of different businesses.
Now, before we get onto those services and hear about some of your experiences, let's take a look at just how widespread loneliness is and who it's affecting. The World Health Organization has declared loneliness a global public health concern as it affects 1 in 6 people worldwide. And it is the most common among young people, with almost 21% of 13 to 17-year-olds feeling lonely, compared to just under 12% age 60 and over. So from that, it's not a surprise that services are popping up to try and meet that demand. And in fact, in Japan, where you're based, it's a pioneer of the loneliness economy. What are some of the experiences or services on offer, and have you tried any?
Yes, so you're so right on the statistic and the fact that Japan is sort of the leading city in terms of loneliness. Just one more thing for your users or your listeners to kind of know about is that in Japan, just like the UK, there's actually a loneliness minister. So this issue of loneliness has really hit even the highest, parts of the government as well. Well, to answer your question, here in Japan, I have experienced certain services. So the first one is really in the solo dining kind of industry. So over here, it's probably the best city I've ever lived in, where eating alone is very common and quite pleasant, in my opinion. There's, ramen restaurants where you don't have to see the waiter. You could just see your food and order everything with a robot or a computer. And there's also listening bars as well, where the whole experience is listening to music. There's vinyl bars or vinyl records everywhere. There's also Lovat, or sort of pet robots for companionship. There's one by Casio, which is extremely popular right now. It's called Moslin, so definitely check that out. And also Lovat, Lovot. And there's even, maid cafes and butler cafes, which I would say is another experience arguably centered around loneliness. So really in Japan, we have a lot of development on this field, and especially targeting the elderly as well, since we have such an aging society.
And this market is also quite developed in China, and you've done a lot of research on virtual companionship. Can you tell me a little bit about the growth of the industry there?
In my research, I experienced the virtual companionship app Xiaobing, which is a Microsoft spin-off chatbot claiming over 600 users. So I actually experienced this AI boyfriend app myself. And in that, I really found it quite interesting how a lot of the users were women as well. So I used the AI kind of boyfriend app. I also rented a boyfriend as well on Taobao, which is, even though it's not an AI boyfriend, it's a real human on the other line. That's another aspect of the virtual companionship industry. One example of it growing is more recently Love and Deep Space, which is a game founded by Paper Games. It's really exploded in popularity, especially among women. well, first of all, the founder himself is actually a billionaire. But women all over, Chinese social media are talking about going on rental dates with like men who are dressed up as the male characters in Love and Deep Space.
And also, did COVID have an impact on that?
Yes, for sure. I think all over the world, really, when we were trapped and in quarantine and trying to figure out how to have that human connection, I think that was really the impetus for kind of the growth in this industry. I also think China, there is a couple of demographic and policy reasons why this sort of a loneliness economy and virtual companionship is so popular.
And we're going to get more into those reasons in a little bit. But first of all, tell me about the experience of renting a boyfriend. And on Taobao, how does that work?
So it's sort of like ordering what to eat on the menu when you're out in a restaurant. So what I did was I was given a rubric on Taobao from a virtual boyfriend seller. So I could choose the boyfriend personality, like a low voice CEO versus, soft boy K-pop. And from there, it was around 20 yuan per half hour. So I talked with the seller, and then immediately I was contacted by someone called Chow Chow, living in Hebei. He was 25, and yeah, kind of chatted with him about what it's like to be a virtual boyfriend and who his clients are. And he said a lot of them were quite high-powered women, which I found very interesting.
That is very interesting. And what kind of things would he talk about with them?
He said he does everything from, talking, saying goodnight to people, studying with them. And I think what was interesting is he said a lot of it was just someone, like people were asking him to just check up on them or honestly yap and chat. I think that is an interesting point. I think when we talk about virtual companionship, especially cultural differences from the West and the East, is when I tell my friends in the US, for example, about these services, they automatically ask if it's sort of more, sexual services. But in fact, what I found is a lot of the demand for these services are purely companionship and just wanting presence from someone else on demand.
Now I want us to take a look at another example of an in-person experience. If you're in China and worried about eating alone, one hotpot chain has got your back. At Haidilao, you can choose to have a stuffed toy accompany you during your meal. You can see it pictured in this photo from a Shanghai branch having dinner with Eli. And this isn't the only service like that in the country. Another chain is letting their customers dine with a stuffed panda. So, Eli, tell me, what was it like having dinner with a stuffed toy?
Yeah, honestly, I was pretty nervous at first because I've never done it before. But once you get over the hump of, eating alone, I think it's an awesome activity to do. If you just want to be by yourself on a Friday night, I think it's lovely. And I think what was it like actually? It was quite comforting, oddly, because I could just focus on the food. And I noticed that the waiters were extremely attentive to me. And they even made sure that my hot pot portions were single serving. They even did the whole, noodle dance for me by myself. And I had a wonderful companion. And next to me, there was actually a group of girls celebrating happy birthday. At first, I thought, is this awkward? Like, would they judge me? They were just doing their own thing too and eating. So I felt quite comfortable eating with the doll.
Did the doll give you extra comfort? Did you feel any judgment or worried about what people would think?
Honestly, not really. I felt like everyone was just doing their thing. But having grown up sort of both in Asia as well as the West, I couldn't help but think, would this fly, let's say in the Cheesecake Factory, if I was eating with a dinosaur, would there be people who would think twice from this, woman with this doll in the West? I feel like I would feel a little bit more judgment in that cultural context. But I found it very fun, personally.
Do you think more establishments should be offering this kind of service? Would you want to see a stuffed animal having in Cheesecake Factory with you?
Well, I think stuffed animal is one way to do it, but I think generally thinking through how to welcome solo diners in general for your establishment is great. So on the one hand, some establishments want communal tables or places where you can meet others. But I think for me, as someone who's, oftentimes, eating alone in Asia, I think it's also lovely when an izakaya, like in Japan, I am one of many people who are solo eating, and hence I find myself naturally striking up conversation with someone next to me. So I do like it when establishments think of the architecture of the place and how to increase more human to human relationships, which honestly is what I yearn for. So the dolls are great, but that's just one way to make a solo diner more comfortable.
Yeah, I definitely feel more comfortable eating alone in Asia, I would say, than back home in the UK. So you mentioned about for the AI boyfriend, a lot of people using that was actually quite high-powered women. But who are the people looking for these service and products more generally? Is it just women? Is it just high-powered women? Or what's the kind of clientele that are driving the loneliness economy?
Right. So in the virtual companionship example for the rent a boyfriend and shopping, I did notice that a lot of the users were women. Of course, there are also male users as well for AI girlfriend counterparts. But I think that the drive is really the kind of trend of emptiness youth, at least in China. So you have a generation of siblingless, young people who travel from rural areas to the city, and they actually live in solo apartments. And then you put on top of that a 996 work culture where you might not actually have a lot of spare hours outside your 9 to 5 or actually 9 to 9. So it makes a lot of sense why, a lot of these highly educated women are, turning to these services. Those kind of, I think, trends kind of point to that.
And why is there such a demand for these kinds of services and that companionship in East Asia specifically? I mean, I know you said about the work culture and stuff, but I know there's so many other reasons.
Yes, so work culture is definitely one of them. And I think when you think of virtual companions like those robotic pets that I mentioned earlier, like Lovat to the Mufflin more recently, I've done some research on cultural differences when it comes to anthropomorphism in general. So in places like China or Japan, we really grew up with anime and this culture of animism and the idea that objects have spirit in them. And they're quite cuddly and cute. In contrast, in the West, when you think of robots with human-like features, it often evokes danger, dystopia, alien invasion. So there's also that factor, which I think makes East Asia specifically quite welcoming when it comes to anthropomorphic objects, which now translates to sort of virtual companions that are at least non-human, like in those two examples I put.
And what about historically any kind of policy issues or something that's like kind of impacted demographic changes that is now seeing people need that companionship?
Right. So I think from the perspective of the really highly aging society, so having a group of, in Japan as well as China, of people in like of 60 plus and not having a lot of people around them, there's definitely a just a demographic difference between this region and outside. In China, obviously, you have on top of that, the one child policy effects as well. So a lot of these policy kind of changes in history impacting, the nuclear family as a unit as well. But you do see kind of in Korea, in Japan especially, so many services targeting the elderly or the silver economy. Even though the demographic chart you put in the beginning said a lot of loneliness is experienced by younger people, that's not to say, of course, a lot of loneliness experienced by people older as well. So I do think that trends like the pet economy for elderly, all these trends, there's a reason for it as well in Asia, just given this population factor.
And could you tell me a little bit more about the services that are targeting the elderly?
So one example I would say is Sony's Parrot. It's this robotic pet seal. One image I have in my mind is when they discontinued this line of robotic pet seals, there were scores of elderly people going to a shrine to mourn the loss of this robotic pet seal. So I remember reading that in my research and thinking, it just really goes to show the amount of like emotional resonance and companionship you have with those pets. Not to mention in Japan specifically, we also have a labor shortage. So a lot of these elderly care homes have that labor shortage issue of not enough people working there. So you can see why some people are coming up with sort of pet robots as one solution. Lovot is another example, Lovot, where it's actually in all the malls in Japan here, or not all of them, but I often pass by Lovot, and Lovot is this robotic pet fluffy. It kind of looks like a penguin, to be honest, and it has a facial recognition camera on the top to recognize you and respond to your facial features. It kind of sounds, I don't know the sounds that it makes, but it's kind of cute. It has its own personality, and in the actual store, you can kind of choose its clothes, its eye color as well, and you can control it with an app. And I do notice in a lot of the marketing, they feature a lot of elderly in it. So those are kind of two examples for the silver economy here in Japan.
That's super interesting. And so other than Asia, what about in the West? Are we seeing, maybe not such quirky solutions, but what are the kind of products or apps on offer when it comes to, the US, UK, Europe?
Yes. So one of the apps that I always follow since I started researching this in around 2021, when I was using Xiaoping, I know the counterpart for the West is Replika, which has been around for over 10 years. So that's kind of the AI friend app. There's also Character AI, which is extremely popular, especially among Gen Z, Gen Alpha. But one that I'm also looking at right now is this kind of trend towards AI companions more broadly and in the hardware sector. So there's Avi Schiffman's friend AI pendant. I don't know how, I don't think it's going to have that much adoption, but that's one of the examples. And the last example, which I'm actually quite interested in, is Tolan, which is a AI friend app that recently raised around 20 million. And it's an AI alien companion, which is gaining a lot of popularity on TikTok among women in their 20s.
Wow. On the topic of Gen Z, it is the loneliest generation in history. And how are these apps changing the way that young people socialize and connect?
That's a great question. So when we think of socializing with Gen Z, yes, we are the loneliest generation, and we're just brought up in this virtual sphere. At the same time, I think that one of the topics that I think is interesting within Gen Z is the rise of anonymous-based socializing, which is something I researched in China when I studied this app called Soul, which is a social kind of metaverse app that is popular among youth. But this idea that when you're socializing anonymously online, the end goal is not necessarily to translate that to an offline meetup, but in fact, there is value in meeting other anonymous souls and chatting online. So you can think in the West, a similar trend would be maybe Discord or certain VR apps where you're socializing online in and of itself. And the overall trend that I study is called hollow tree or shudong, which is generally the burdening or unburdening of one's own secrets onto almost like a hollow tree, which was inspired by one of the films from Ang Lee, in which the protagonist at the end of the film whispers a secret into a hollow tree at the end of the film. But there is value that some Gen Zers are kind of having from just purely talking with other people online.
And we've talked about all these services, apps, experiences that you can have. Do you think they're helping the problem, or are they exploiting that need for human connection?
So I think that line is very kind of gray. I do have some examples, like if we purely leave this loneliness issue to the free market and we let, the Elon Musks of the world, like, for example, XAI recently released Annie on their Grok, which I think is an example of more exploitative, where, as an example, Annie recently broke the Apple Store basically in Japan because of the amount of users flooding to the app. But the app Annie is basically an AI girlfriend app, which incentivizes and rewards users for engaging more on Annie, which is like $30 a week or something like that. But if you use Annie more, it also unlocks certain features like adult mode. And there's a lot of kind of conversations on Twitterverse about how that just feels like not a world that I personally want to live in, where we're clearly exploiting the male loneliness issue there. But I do think that there are examples, like I would say Tolan is one example where I do appreciate how this companionship app is not overtly trying to replace or over-sexualize another human being, but in fact, almost be additive, or the Tolan being an alien, not a human. So I think I hope to work towards a future where we can write these rules of conduct for, the fact that we know the AI companionship industry is growing, but how can we actually do it to enhance and not replace human relationships?
And looking forward at this space, how do you see the loneliness economy developing over the next 10 years or so?
Yeah, so I would say the opposite of loneliness is community and social connection. And you mentioned Gen Z as an example. I think that this generation is craving more of the going back to IRL and third spaces. So I think whether it's run clubs and board game nights to creative ways of meeting other people in big cities, I do think this generation also has like a sense of innovation when it comes to how can we be creative and disrupt just the Tinderification of the world. I think people don't want just a swipe right, swipe left to meet friends or significant others. So I see a lot of innovation there. The second thing is I think a lot of venture capital and investment and there's literal money flooding into this sector. But I also have concerns about that in terms of the rise of paywalls for connection. I think is already a trend we're seeing where, you have to join or pay $300 a month in order to have access to a Soho house or, a social, like a co-working space like ground floor, for example, or social bathhouses. So I do think that there is kind of a bit of a concern if it comes to deepening the divide of the haves and the have-nots. But honestly, I think it goes back to also what I said earlier on how can we make sure that these technologies are still ethical. I think there's a lag always in overprotection kind of in the real world and underprotection in the online world as of right now, which is something that like the Anxious Generation, Jonathan Haidt wrote about. And I think that hopefully in the next 10 years, there will be more people talking about this and also more diverse people in the room creating these technologies to make sure we're not exacerbating the loneliness issue or profiting from it, but actually building a future we want to live in with more connection and, in my opinion, more human connection and using technology to help rather than take away from that.
That was some fascinating insights. Thank you so much for being on the show. Eli Morimoto, a writer in tech and human connection and author of the Loneliness Economy Substack.